This is the Orient House, located here in the eastern section of the city of Jerusalem. It's a center of controversy between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The late Faisal Husseini was headquartered here as the representative for the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Jerusalem. And it has been somewhat of a capital for the proposed Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as the capital city. What it actually does for us, it emphasizes the conflict between two brothers, Jacob and Esau, the Israelis and the Palestinians. That conflict has been going on now for some 4,000 years. It dates back to the time of Abraham, his son Isaac, and then the twin sons of Isaac, Jacob and Esau. The Bible tells us in the 25th chapter of the book of Genesis that God told Rebekah, the mother of these two boys, they would each become a nation. Jacob, we know, would become the nation of Israel. But what about Esau? What nation did he become? Esau was put out of the promised land, 36th chapter of the book of Genesis. God directed him to the southern portion of modern-day Jordan, to a place called Mount Seir, and he headquartered in a city called Petra. We'll be visiting Petra just a little bit later on in this video. 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, the Nabateans, they were the famous stone carvers from over in Arabia, had befriended the Edomites, but then they turned against the Edomites, killing many of the Edomites there in this impregnable city called Petra. Some escaped, made a westward turn, going over into southern Judah, and they became the Idumeans. At that point in time, their capital, their nation, had been devastated. This was a prophecy given by the last prophet in the Old Testament, Malachi. In the book of Malachi, chapter 1, God had told both of these brothers, or their descendants at that time in history, that he loved Jacob and he hated Esau. Now, that's not an emotional experience that was going on in the heart of God. This was his sovereign selection. God, as he had with the sons of Abraham, selected the second-born, the younger of the two, to have the responsibility of receiving not only the birthright, but the blessing from his father Abraham, replacing Ishmael, the firstborn. Now, in the case of Jacob and Esau, the firstborn, howbeit just simply by a body link, even we remember Jacob had his hand on the heel of his twin brother Esau, but Jacob was the secondborn, Esau the firstborn. He was to receive the birthright and the blessing. God sovereignly selected the younger over the elder for his purposes in the future. And then he devastated Esau and his nation there in the area that is known today as modern-day Jordan, the lower third, Edom, there at Petra. But Esau said, I will return. I will rebuild. And God said, I will call your borders the borders of wickedness, and I will have indignation against you forever. It's the story of two brothers. We'd like to continue to tell that story as we travel through the land and show you from God's Word, God's plan for both of these brothers. Come travel with me, if you will, to their hometown near Beersheba. Here on the wind-swept slopes of this little mound, here in the desert area just outside of Beersheba, modern-day city of Beersheba, and very close to biblical Beersheba, which was the hometown of Abraham some 4,000 years ago. It was here that he raised his son Isaac. And then Isaac would raise his two twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Remains of an ancient well here in Beersheba. Brings back many, many thoughts about how they would have watered their cattle, watered their fields here at Beersheba. We have to go back these 4,000 years to continue the story of two boys, the sons of Isaac and Rebekah, which are talked about right here in the 25th chapter of the book of Genesis. This is the record of how they came to this earth to live out their lives and to establish two nations that would basically be fighting each other throughout all the generations. The 25th chapter of the book of Genesis, starting in verse 19, it talks about the generations of Abraham's son Isaac. And Isaac, at 40 years of age, took a wife. Her name was Rebekah. She was from Syria. She was a lady whose womb was barren, interestingly. So was the womb of Isaac's mother, Sarah. And God opened that womb and gave Abraham the son of promise, Isaac. And now Isaac goes to the Lord and starts praying for his wife's womb to be opened. Well, the Lord opened Rebekah's womb, and sometimes I mentioned that maybe you got to watch how you pray, because as Isaac prayed, he prayed for a son that could carry on his heritage. Instead, God gave him two sons, twin boys. Most likely the first record in the Bible of twins being born. The firstborn was Esau, secondborn Jacob. Howbeit he was less than a body length second, holding on to his brother's heel as he came forth. Actually, before they were ever born, they started to struggle. They started to fight even in the womb of their mother. The Bible tells us here in the 25th chapter of Genesis, verse 22, and the children struggled together within her, and she said, why is this so? So she went to the Lord to find out why this was going on. A very important verse here is verse 23, where the Lord answers the prayer, the request for knowledge by Rebekah, but also gives a prophecy. The Lord says, and the Lord said unto her, two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And they are people that will have confrontation with the elder serving the younger. We know that tradition at the time was that the firstborn was to receive not only the birthright, but the blessing from his father at the end of his father's life to carry on the heritage. The Bible records the story of how the birthright was lost by the firstborn Esau to his supposedly conniving brother Jacob. Here in the 27th verse of the 25th chapter of Genesis, and the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of the venison. Rebekah, the mother of the two boys, loved the son Jacob. And Jacob, he prepared the pottage. He sod the pottage. And one day he had prepared a wonderful meal. He was out in the field. He was confronted by his brother Esau, who was quite hungry. Esau said, give me some of that lunch that you've prepared there, Jacob. Well, Jacob knew exactly what he was doing. Ultimately, he ended up making a deal with Esau that he would give him all of the meal if he would then trade for that meal his birthright. And supposedly conniving, and I say that supposedly conniving because the Bible had already said that God had said the elder would serve the younger. And so the elder would lose the birthright. This sovereign selection would begin right here, choosing the secondborn over the firstborn. Same thing happened in the 27th chapter of the book of Genesis. There we see that Isaac, just at the point of death, almost blind, not able to really tell who was even in the room with him, would call for his son Esau to go into the field, find a deer, kill it, and prepare some venison stew for him. And as they came together for the meal, and then Isaac would pronounce the blessing over his firstborn Esau. Rebekah heard about this, and she immediately, as Esau took off across the fields looking someplace for a deer to prepare the venison stew, she went to Jacob and says, I've got an idea. We can get not only the birthright, we can get the blessing from your father Isaac as well. Esau's gone to the field. We'll dress you up as Esau, put on some of his clothing, and we'll get some animal skin that's hairy and put it on your arm because your brother's very hairy. Your father's not going to be able to see. I've got venison stew that I prepared. I taught Esau how to prepare the stew. You can take it in and you can pretend that you're Esau and receive the blessing from your father. That's exactly what the text tells us in the 27th chapter of the book of Genesis. Well, Jacob had just left having received the blessing from his father Isaac, and in walks Esau. Abba, Hebrew for daddy. Abba, I'm here to receive the blessing. I've prepared the venison stew. Isaac all of a sudden said, "Now wait a minute. I have just given I thought that was Esau. That wasn't you that I just gave the blessing to. It must have been your conniving brother Jacob." And again, that thought of a brother who manipulated, who connived to get not only the birthright but the blessing, but God had promised that indeed the elder would serve the younger. Well, Isaac, having given the blessing, had no blessing to give to Esau, but Esau wanted a blessing. In fact, it says he lifted up his voice and cried, demanding that he receive a blessing. The Bible tells us that Esau, after Jacob had given the blessing to his younger brother, that Esau would hate Jacob. Because of that, their mother, Rebekah, said that Jacob had better leave the land, and so he would go north into Haran, which is modern-day Turkey, and there live with her brother for a period of years before he would come back into the land. Well, as we move through the account of Esau and Jacob moving further into the book of Genesis, we come to the 36th chapter now of the book of Genesis. Jacob has made his way back south here into Canaan, into the land of Israel. His brother Esau had somewhat come to an understanding of what had taken place, and so they were coexisting in this land. Both of them were very, very prosperous. God then, because of their prosperity, was going to have to divide them. Both of them could not live in this land. In fact, in chapter 36 and verse 7, it says, "For their riches were more than that they might dwell together in this land wherein they were strangers, and it could not bear them because of all of their cattle." Over in the 37th chapter, verse 1, Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. So God was here through sovereign selection, giving the land to the younger brother, the second-born, sovereignly selecting the second-born over the firstborn. He's now going to have Esau leave the land of Canaan, the land of promise, and go to Mount Seir. In verse 8, "Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir." Esau is Edom. We'll find out in just a few moments as I continue to tell this story of Esau and the Palestinians that Esau is going to take his family and move southeast of the area of the Dead Sea into what at that time was referred to as Mount Seir. Today it's modern-day Jordan. In biblical times it was the lower third of Jordan and known as Edom. Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Take a map of biblical lands and look at the Dead Sea and go east from the south of the Dead Sea all the way to the Red Sea. You're talking about the land of Edom, Mount Seir, and to a location that Esau would go and establish his capital in a place called Petra. We'll be visiting there in just a few moments. But before we make that journey, let me tell you something of great interest. Here in the 12th verse of chapter 36, we find out who Esau's grandson was. And Timnah was a concubine to Eliphaz, Esau's son. And she bare to Eliphaz Amalek. And these are the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. So the grandson of Esau, the son of Eliphaz, was Amalek, who had become the father of the Amalekites. Now this story needs to be continued. On a mountainous range where Moses would one day, as he was leading the children of Israel through the promised land, be confronted by the Amalekites. He would be victorious. He would have the opportunity to kill most of the Amalekites who had become his enemy, but not all. And that line from Esau through Amalek all the way down to today would continue on. That story will be continued in another location. Right now, here on this windswept little mountain on the fields of Beersheba, my thoughts are on Esau and Jacob, two twin brothers. The text telling us these boys would one day grow up and their families, their heritage, would become two nations. You would have confrontation between them throughout all of the generations. It was almost 4,000 years ago when God directed Esau and his descendants to leave the land of Canaan and go to Mount Seir. Mount Seir, the lower third of modern-day Jordan, would later be renamed Edom after the descendants of Esau. God would allow Jacob and his descendants to remain in the land of Canaan, which is modern-day Israel. Then 3,500 years ago, after 400 years plus of the Jewish people being in the Egyptian bondage, God would raise up Moses to lead the children of Israel towards the promised land. Now they would be wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. And in that first year of their wandering, they would come to a location called Rephidim. In the 17th chapter of the book of Exodus, we see the account of the children of Israel being confronted by the Amalekites, the descendants of Amalek, Esau's grandson. It was there in the valley below that the children of Israel, the Israelites, would be confronted by the Amalekites. The Amalekites wanted to destroy the Jewish people. But God had another plan. God would allow Moses to be on the mountain peak along with Aaron and Hur, and there, God would give Moses the capability of holding the rod of God above his head. As long as he was able to keep it above his head, the Israelites would win the battle in the valley below. When he would grow weary and drop his arms down, and then the Amalekites would start to be victorious over the Israelites. God would then give strength to Moses. He would lift his arms, the rod above his head, and the Israelites would again start to win the battle. Finally, Moses grew so weary that Aaron and Hur would hold his arms up. The Israelites were victorious. Not all of the Amalekites were killed. Some of them would escape. But in this 17th chapter of Exodus, God directs Moses to write this down for a memorial. First time any place in the Bible where somebody was told to write something down. The Lord said unto Moses, "Write this for a memorial in a book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua." Joshua, of course, the first lieutenant for Moses, who would actually take the children of Israel into the promised land. Very interesting phrase in the 16th verse here. The Lord says that he will have war with Amalek from generation unto generation. As we continue the story of two brothers, 3,000 years ago, in a site just outside of Jerusalem, Gibeah, the site of the palace of the first king of Israel, King Saul, that which was written in the book, the event that took place at Rephidim when the Edomites tried to destroy the Israelites, it would be remembered in the mind of God. And God would instruct the prophet Samuel to give King Saul the responsibility of wiping out, killing all the Amalekites. We need to go from here to Gibeah to continue this story. This is Mount Gibeah, located here at the edge of the Judean wilderness, just outside the city of Jerusalem. Behind me, the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River, the mountains across the Jordan River, the country of Jordan, modern-day Jordan. Location of Mount Seir in the days of Esau. That's where God directed Esau and his descendants to go to live. But the story of the two brothers continues here. This is the remains of a palace that the late King Hussein of Jordan was building just prior to the Six-Day War in 1967. It's also the site of the palace of the first king of Israel, King Saul. And Samuel the prophet would come here to continue the unfolding of this story of the two brothers. The unfinished palace of one king, the late King Hussein of Jordan, and the actual historic site of a palace of another king, King Saul, the first king of Israel. As we continue our story of the two brothers, it takes us to the book of 1 Samuel. That's the book in the Bible that records all the activities of this first king of Israel, King Saul. And as we come to chapter 15, we see that those things written in that book back in Exodus chapter 17 would be rehearsed before King Saul. In chapter 15 and verse 1, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over all of Israel," right here in this location. "Now therefore, hearken unto the voice of the words of the Lord." Here's another message that God has from Samuel the prophet to King Saul. "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when they came up from Egypt." Of course, that is recorded in the 17th chapter of Exodus and the incident that took place there at Rephidim. Verse 3, "Now go and smite Amalek, the grandson of Esau, and the father of the Amalekites. Go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both the men and the women, the infant and the suckling, the ox and the sheep, the camel and the ass." God gave a directive to the prophet Samuel to tell King Saul, kill all of the Amalekites, all of their possessions. And interestingly, at this particular site here in Israel, the command would not be kept. After several days, the prophet Samuel returned to King Saul to see if he had been following the direction that had come from God through him, the prophet, to the king. Samuel asked King Saul, "Have you killed the Amalekites?" He assured him he had. "What about the animals of the Amalekites?" And as he was even speaking, "But," Samuel said to King Saul, "What was that?" "I'm not sure." "Now let me ask you again. You killed all of the Amalekites?" "Yes, I did." "You killed all of their animals?" "But," and again this sound. Samuel said to King Saul, "Sounds like the sound of a sheep to me." He said, "Oh, that's right. I kept some of the sheep because they were pure, perfect, without blemish, without spot. I thought that we could offer them in sacrifice." Very interesting statement made by the prophet Samuel. He said, it's better to be obedient than to offer sacrifice. And then the prophet Samuel asked King Saul, "Did you kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites?" "No, I didn't." "Why not?" "We could use his riches to further our nation, the nation of Israel." Now Samuel is very much disturbed with the disobedience of King Saul, so he tells him to bring Agag to him. Agag, the king of the Amalekites, stands there in front of him. The Bible tells us in chapter 15 of the book of 1 Samuel and in verse 33, "And Samuel said to Agag, the king of the Amalekites, As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women." And Samuel hewed Agag into pieces before the Lord. God told Samuel to deliver the message to King Saul, kill all of the Amalekites. An Israeli general today, not too long ago, was talking with me, and he told me the problem, even in present-day Israel, is because of the failure of King Saul to follow the command from God to kill all of the Amalekites. Today, the Israelis are continually confronted in conflict with the Amalekites. Well, this is not the end of the story of the two brothers. Some of these Amalekites escaped from here in Gibeah. They made their way into Persia. We'll tell you more about that in just a few moments. I was just remembering a story that my son Jimmy told me as I looked at the unfinished palace of the late King Hussein. In 1994, when they had decided to sign a peace treaty with Israel, the Israelis allowed the Jordanians to have their king, King Hussein, who piloted his own 747, fly across the airspace of Israel. In fact, he flew over this unfinished palace. Jimmy and a good friend, Minnow Kalashir, were out on the patio watching as the plane came down low so the king could see the palace. In fact, Jimmy told me he even saw the king at the cockpit of that big 747. Well, it was a palace where I take you for the next chapter in the story of the two brothers. It was a palace where King Ahasuerus reigned. He was the fourth of the Persian kings and the richest of all the Persian kings thus far. He was married to Vashti. You might remember the story as recorded in the book of Esther. King Ahasuerus dethroned Queen Vashti and then had his court bring before him candidates to become queen. He selected one named Esther. Unbeknownst to him, she was a Jewess, and she had a cousin whose name was Mordecai. One day, Haman, the number 2 in the land, the villain actually of the book of Esther, came walking through the gate. As he did, everybody bowed except one person, the cousin to the queen, Mordecai. Haman turned around and said to Mordecai, "You didn't bow to me." Mordecai said, "I'm not going to bow to you. I don't bow to anybody except God." Well, this very much disturbed Haman. He went into the palace. He met with the king, King Ahasuerus. He said, "You know how we had to deal with Queen Vashti? I think we're going to have to deal with these Jews now. There's one outside not respecting leadership. He did not bow to me as I entered the city." And of course, the king then looked to his second in command. What should we do? Haman said, "I think we should kill all of the Jews. You write down the law of the Medes and the Persians. And I will carry that law out, and we will kill all of the Jews." And of course, if you remember the book of Esther, for such a time as this, Queen Esther had come into the kingdom, and she would, of course, save the Jewish people. I told you that story only to bring you to a verse in chapter 3 of the book of Esther. Here's what it says. "After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Abadathah, the Agagite." The Agagite. He was a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel chapter 15. The Amalekites? Well, they were all descendants of Amalek, the grandson of Esau, 36th chapter of the book of Genesis. Do you see the progression? Esau, Amalek, his grandson, Agag, the king of the Amalekites, Haman, a descendant of Agag. Oh, by the way, Haman had a great-great-great-great-great-grandson as well. His name, Herod the Great. All descendants of Esau, the blessing that Isaac gave to Esau, you will live by the sword, you will kill your brother. The story of two brothers, conflict down through every generation. Now through God's sovereign selection, he chooses Jacob and gives him the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel. The second-born receives that which was supposedly granted to the firstborn. And that sovereign selection then affects the life of Esau, who becomes Edom. He is sent from the land of Canaan here into what is southern Jordan today. It's referred to in the Bible as Mount Seir. Verse 8 says, "Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir." Esau is Edom. Behind me Petra, the mountains of Petra, the location that Esau would select as the capital of his geographical location, his nation, the Edomites. We'll go into Petra in just a few moments. We'll see why Esau would have selected this impregnable city. It was a very secure city. The king's highway would come by it. He would use that then as a way to rob the merchants making their way on to Mecca and over into the Persian Gulf. Come with me now, and let's go to the entrance of Petra here in Edom. This would be a portion of the King's Highway that would make its way right here in front of the Sikh that leads into Petra. Sikh, an Arabic word which means high, narrow gorge. We'll take you through the Sikh in just a moment and explain why this was such an impregnable city. But it was to Petra here in Edom, at the time referred to as Mount Seir, the lower third of modern-day Jordan, where God would sovereignly select Esau to move to this portion of the Middle East, leaving Jacob over in Canaan, or what we know today as modern-day Israel. Here in the 37th chapter of the book of Genesis, we see that God said, "And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." Sovereign selection goes into play as God selects the younger son over the elder son, the one who was to have received the birthright and the blessing from his father to pass on the heritage to the next generations. Chapter 36 explains to us that God now takes the eldest son and he moves him out of the promised land here into Mount Seir, and they headquarter here in Petra. We'll talk about the reason for having this as their base, their capital city, in just a few moments as we walk through the Sikh. The reason, and one of the physical reasons, that God divided these two brothers was because of their riches. It says here in the 36th chapter of the book of Genesis, "For their riches were more than that they might dwell together, and the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle." Both had become so prosperous, and God had to divide them. This part is all of his plan, his sovereign selection of the secondborn over the firstborn. Verse 8, "Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir." Esau is Edom. He selects Petra here in the lower third of modern-day Jordan, known in biblical times as Edom. He selects this particular geographical location for the descendants of Esau to headquarter in during biblical times. It was along this King's Highway that Moses would have traveled with the children of Israel, making his way from the Egyptian bondage over and crossing their Jordan in Jericho. But because of the Edomites' antagonism against the Jewish people and the children of Israel, Moses was confronted by the Edomites here, told that he could not come this way. Moses quickly said, "Well, if my cattle drink your water, eat your grass, I'll pay for it." The Edomites refused to allow the children of Israel, being led by Moses, to go on towards Jericho and the Promised Land. Instead, they had to make their way south and then all the way over near Arabia, coming across the desert land into Shittim, there where they encamped before they crossed over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. But as I said, they selected this particular location because it was an impregnable city. I think to be able to understand that, we need to walk through the Sikh and walk into this 22 square mile unique city of Petra. Come along with me as we walk through the Sikh, and I'll explain more as we travel. When Esau came here to live in the Mount Seir mountain range, he understood that he had to protect his family, and so they would select a location that would do exactly that. And he comes here to Petra. He discovers this location, and I told you that it was an impregnable city. As we approach the Sikh here in our journey on into the city, we realize that, well, you can see, it's a location where just a small group of men might be able to protect themselves from any military force that would be coming this way. And from here they could make their way out of the Sikh, rob the merchants, back into the Sikh and just placed several men here at the entrance to stop anybody from coming into the Sikh. An impregnable city. You need to see the city of Petra, the capital for the Edomites, about 4,000 years ago. Come along with me. You can just tell how narrow it's going to get, only about 50 feet down the way as we make our journey through the Sikh here at Petra. And then you're also able to see the height of the walls that protect this city. At some locations, and as we travel, you'll be able to see, as I'm making my walk along, 300 to 500 feet, maybe sometimes 600 feet. If indeed the several Edomites that would be standing here to protect their city were overrun, and then as the enemy would continue on through the Sikh into the city, the men with the pots of boiling water could pour it on top of them, stopping them from entering into this their capital here in Edom. Come along. As we make our way in, let me just pause here for a moment. These are the remains of an aqueduct, the water system by which the Edomites would be able to survive. They needed the water. This is one way that they would bring the water in from outside. Come along. Here's an example of how narrow the Sikh is. I mean, my arm span is about 7 feet. Maybe it extends out to 10, 12 feet here. And then looking down, you can see very, very narrow, the way of protection of the Sikh. Dramatic. As you stop at this spot right here on the way inside the city of Petra, to see how protected the city really is. And in addition to that, beautiful as we journey in. You caught me. I'm taking a little bit of a rest. We're about halfway through the Sikh into the city of Petra. What a place of refreshment, a little oasis right here in the Sikh. Reminding you that the book of Revelation in chapter 12 and verse 6, God says to the Jewish people, I will prepare a place to protect you during the terrible time of tribulation. And as we make our way on into Petra, you will understand that this fits all the requirements, the description by Jesus Christ, for example. He says in Matthew chapter 24 that when the abomination of desolation takes place, that's when the Antichrist walks into the temple in Jerusalem, goes into the Holy of Holies, and there he sits down and claims to be God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4. The abomination of desolation takes place, and Jesus reminding the Jewish people of the prophecy from Daniel. He said, when you see that happening, flee for the mountains. Well, we're here in the mountains. It says in Revelation chapter 12, go to the wilderness. And indeed, we are in the wilderness. It's a place prepared by God to protect the Jewish people for the 3.5 years. Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 says, 2 out of every 3 Jews will be killed, but the remaining 4 million protected here. Now, I know that it's an open sky and a helicopter could come in and devastate anybody by dropping a bomb into the city. And as we get into the city, you'll see how that is much more of a possibility. But as God provided for the Jewish people as they wandered in the wilderness, so he will during that last 3.5 years, the time of Jacob's trouble. And here in the city of Petra, they will be protected until Jesus Christ comes here to take them on to Jerusalem and begin his millennial reign. his millennial kingdom. Let's go in and see the city. Well, we've almost made our way through the 1.25 miles down the Seek and into the entrance of the city of Petra. As I move across this narrow gorge, you can see through the heights of the narrow gorge the remains of the treasury building. It was carved out of the sandstone by the Nabateans almost 500 years ago. You'll be able to understand why people would choose this location to headquarter their military might, the Edomites, headquartering here in the city of Petra. About 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, the Nabateans, who would have befriended the Edomites, would be invited to a banquet here in Petra. They'd make their way through the Seek, which was protecting, of course, this city, the capital for the Edomites, and they would come into the city. Now, behind me is the treasury, one of the examples of the stone carving capabilities. This is 5 stories high, and the Nabateans would carve from top to bottom, extending their ropes over the edge of the cliff there, and then start to carve out this beautiful edifice here, the treasury in the city of Petra, until they completed it. As we make our way on through Petra, we'll see many examples. Let's look at other examples. In addition to the treasury building that the Nabateans would have carved out of the sandstone at the entrance of the city of Petra, about 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, they would have taken to the cliffs here in Petra and carved out the individual homes, the burial sites, the temples, right here in the stone on the cliffs of Petra. Just down the path, and we'll make our way there, the Colosseum, carved by the Nabateans many years ago. The Colosseum here in the city of Petra, as I pointed out to you from our other vantage point. Another example of the talented stone carving done by the Nabateans here in this city where they had developed a relationship with the Edomites. This Colosseum probably could seat between 5,000 and 7,000 people, with the burial sites, the homes, the temples, the Colosseum, the treasury building. Examples of the stone carving of the Nabateans. I've had my cameraman focus on one of the caves there in the clefts of the rock. There are many other caves that you see on the cliffs in the city of Petra, and the Lord referred to that when he inspired Obadiah to write to the Edomites and the reasons that he was going to destroy them. One of the reasons would be in the book of Obadiah, verse 10, for the violence against their brother Jacob. In other words, the killing of the Jews. But a second reason was because of their pride. The Bible tells us here in the 3rd verse of Obadiah, "The pride of thy heart hath deceived thee, thou that dwellest in the cleft of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, Who shall bring me down to the ground?" You can see on the clefts of the rock they could perch there. In fact, he even talks about the fact that they may be exalting themselves as the eagle. And though they set their nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. The book of Obadiah, a prophecy saying that the Edomites, the Palestinians of today, would be defeated. God would bring them down because of their pride, and because of their violence against the Jewish people. These columns may well have been standing here at the time of the banquet as recorded in the book of Obadiah. It was a banquet where the Edomites had invited their friends, the Nabateans, the famous stone carvers here in Petra, to come and have a time with them. The prophet Obadiah received a prophecy 300 years before the fact of how the Edomites would be destroyed, devastated here in their city, their capital city of protection. In the little book of Obadiah, verse 7, it says this, "And all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee." The Nabateans at the banquet table would take their swords, starting to kill the Edomites, trying to destroy them and take over this wilderness fortress. Some of the Edomites would make their way running quickly through the sea and then turn westward across the Jordan Valley over into southern Judah and become the Idumeans. Their mountain wilderness stronghold, their fortress, had been devastated. They'd lost their capital in Edom, and now would become a different people in the land of Israel. Walking here on a street that dates back 2,000 years ago to the time of Jesus Christ, located here in the old city of Jerusalem. It's right adjacent to the Western Wall, the Western retaining wall that Herod the Great would have built. He was an Edomian, you might remember, a descendant of Esau. You can see the remains of the markets, and then this street would have continued underneath Robinson's Arch, the remains of which are there on the Western retaining wall. These stones, well, they date back to the Roman invasion of Jerusalem in 70 AD. One of the reasons that Herod was known as Herod the Great was because he was a great builder, as evidenced by this retaining wall, the Western retaining wall of the Temple Mount. He also refurbished the temple, the Jewish temple, just on the other side of this retaining wall. Herod used 10,000 men over a number of years to build this edifice that the rabbis said if you had never seen Herod's temple and the complex, you'd never seen a beautiful building. As I said, Herod was an Edomian. He was a descendant of Esau. And in 70 AD, this wall, the remains of which we see some of here behind me in the pile of stones, these Western Wall retaining wall stones, this wall was destroyed by the Roman army. The temple was devastated. The city was destroyed, and the Jews were dispersed to the four corners of the earth. That was found in prophecy in response to a question that the disciples asked Jesus Christ during the Olivet Discourse. He walked from the temple and he said, "There will not be a stone standing upon a stone." That very much puzzled the disciples. They understood all the labor that had gone into building not only the temple, but this retaining wall. But then Jesus said in a record of that Olivet Discourse, Luke chapter 21 and verse 24, "And they shall fall by the sword, the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Jesus was referring to 70 AD and the prophecy that he made, not a stone upon a stone on the Temple Mount would be found, was fulfilled in 70 AD. The Jews were joined by their cousins, actually by brothers, the descendants of Esau, the descendants of Jacob, coming together to fight the Romans. They both lost. The Jews were dispersed to the four corners of the earth, as the book of Deuteronomy said they would be. The descendants of Esau, well, they were dispersed to the Balkans, to a place called Bosnia. The Jews would return to the land, and so would the Edomites. We continue our story of the two brothers as we talk about what happened as these two peoples would return from around the world here to the land of promise, the land of Israel. And now we jump ahead almost 2,000 years to 1917. The Edomites, descendants of Esau, assisted the Jewish people when they fought the Romans in 70 AD, before the city was devastated, the temple destroyed, and the Jews dispersed to the four corners of the earth. As I mentioned, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, were dispersed to the Balkans and into a place called Bosnia. I've just come out of the Jaffa Gate. It's a very interesting story that unfolds here as I continue the story of the two brothers. In 1917, the Brits were fighting the Turks in the Jezreel Valley. General Allenby, the commanding officer of the British forces, defeated the mighty Turkish army in the Jezreel Valley, which marked the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire. General Allenby came then here to Jerusalem, did a mopping up exercise. He got word that the Turks were ready to surrender. They were going to surrender here at the Tower of David, just inside the Jaffa Gate. General Allenby mounted his white horse, rode to the Jaffa Gate, and as he approached the Jaffa Gate, he dismounted. His military aide said, "Sir, are you not going into the ceremony? The Turks are ready to surrender to the British Empire." He said, "I'm going in, but I'm not going to ride my white horse in." The general, as I understand it, according to his nephew, on the 75th anniversary of this particular incident, related to me that General Allenby said to his military aide, "No, I'll not ride my white horse in today. One day my Savior Jesus Christ will ride a white horse into this city." I'll tell you the remaining parts of this story inside of the Tower of David. It's normally pretty crowded and noisy right here at the entrance of the old city through the Jaffa Gate. And as General Allenby entered the old city that day, coming here to the entrance of the Tower of David to receive the surrender from the Ottoman Empire, wasn't as noisy maybe, and not quite as much traffic, but the crowds would throng this little square. I remember being told by the late daughter, the youngest daughter of Horatio Spafford, who was a missionary here in Jerusalem at that time, 1917. He and his family would have been seated there on the balcony of the hotel, witnessing this historic event. It was December the 9th, 1917. General Allenby enters the Jaffa Gate, dismounting from his horse, walking in here to the entrance of the Tower of David. And right here on this spot, he would stand and receive the surrender from the leaders of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, the Turks who had controlled the Middle East for 400 years. Now the British Empire would take control of the Middle East. Actually, it was the beginning of the redemption for the Jewish people. Well, that's another story. The story of the two brothers, though, had, as an effect of this particular event that took place here at the Tower of David, a continuation of its story. That day, after receiving the surrender, General Allenby realized he needed to name a mayor for the city of Jerusalem. He looked and found the highest ranking Muslim cleric in the community. His name was Husseini el-Husseini. And he named that day Husseini el-Husseini as the mayor of Jerusalem. As he started to depart, he noticed a little boy holding on to the shirt sleeve of Husseini el-Husseini. Caught his attention. Very cute little boy there you have. No, he said, "That's my nephew." "Oh, what's his name?" "Aman el-Husseini. He's 11 years old. What a cute young nephew that you have." Well, General Allenby departed, left the surrender ceremony. The British Empire took over, and Aman el-Husseini grew up. It's now 1935. Aman el-Husseini has made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He becomes the Hajj Aman el-Husseini. And then he comes here to Jerusalem and is declared the Mufti of Jerusalem, the highest ranking Muslim in the Middle East. In the early 40s, he received a communication from Adolf Hitler in Berlin. Adolf Hitler sent the message, "If you want to know how to exterminate the Jewish people, come to Berlin and we'll work together." the Hajj Aman al-Husseini made his way to Berlin, Hitler had built the largest, most powerful radio station in the world on the coast of the Mediterranean in Monaco. 1 million watts of power. Hitler told Hajj Aman al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, the highest ranking Muslim in the entire Middle East, that all he needed to do was go on that powerful radio station and call for all the Muslims of the world to rise up for the honor of Allah and kill the Jewish people. And then Hitler told Hajj Aman al-Husseini, you need to go to Bosnia to gather in your descendants. Remember, the Edomites were dispersed to Bosnia. Adolf Hitler had been using the elite commando unit from Bosnia at the apex of his blitzkrieg. The blitzkrieg, he would form his army into a V, and right at the apex of that V, he would put this elite commando unit from Bosnia, and that's the way they would take over the countries throughout all of Europe during World War II. The Hajj Aman al-Husseini, as is depicted in some of the documentation at the Holocaust Museum, did go to Bosnia. He inspected this elite commando unit, and then he brought them right here into Israel. It's now 1948, and at Latrun, the site today of the Tank Museum, but in 1948, the site of a major battle in the War of Independence as the Jewish people worked to establish their state among the states of all the nations of the world, right here in the Middle East. Behind the Tank Museum here at Latrun is the Valley of Ayalon. It was a location where the children of Israel, under the leadership of Joshua, would have fought those who did not want the Israelites to enter the Promised Land. In 1948, it was the scene of a major battle. A dear friend of mine, Zvi Kalashir, told me of the battle in that field behind Latrun. You see, Latrun at the time of the War of Independence was an Arab police station, an Arab military site to keep the Jewish people from getting up to Jerusalem. Actually, that entire field had been mined, and Zvi crawled on his hands and knees to defuse all of those mines. They had to gain this particular spot in order to be able to come from Tel Aviv and make their way to Jerusalem. Zvi told me in a conversation that we once had, the fierce fighting force of the Bosnians, the elite commando unit, which Adolf Hitler had used in his blitzkrieg when he would take over the nations of Europe, they joined with the Muslims of the world right here at this location to try and destroy the nation of Israel. That elite commando unit from Bosnia, the location that the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, went when they were dispersed in 70 AD from the land of Israel in the city of Jerusalem. And by the way, I was talking to you about the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Hajj Aman al-Husseini. He was the nephew, remember, of Husseini al-Husseini, the man that General Allenby appointed the first mayor of Jerusalem. The Hajj Aman al-Husseini had a nephew as well, and his name, Yasser Arafat, in the line from Esau down through the years to Amalek, Agag, Haman, Herod the Great, Husseini al-Husseini, the Hajj Aman al-Husseini, Yasser Arafat, and now Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, who promised when he was sworn in as the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, he would carry forth his leader, Yasser Arafat's policies in the future to endeavor to destroy the Jewish people, removing them from the land of Israel. And the story of the two brothers continues. We come to the conclusion of our story of the two brothers, Jacob and Esau, by referring to the book of Obadiah, the smallest book in the Old Testament, a prophecy given to the prophet Obadiah some 2,800 years ago. The first 14 verses of Obadiah are history, actually prophecy that has been fulfilled. Coming to verse 15, we read, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all of the heathen," in other words, upon the Gentiles. "As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return unto thine own head." The day of the Lord is a phrase used 72 times in the Bible. Its definition, any time in history when God intercedes in the affairs of man personally on the earth. Its practical application is referring to the time that Jesus Christ, the Messiah, will come back here to the earth. Seated here on the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley behind me, and then where the Dome of the Rock and the Eastern Gate are, that would be the old city and the Temple Mount where Jesus Christ will rule and reign. And so he's referring to that time when Jesus will come back to this spot and go across the Kidron Valley into his temple. In verse 16, "For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain," now that phrase, used 18 times in the Bible, is referring to the Temple Mount, the holy mountain of God. What does it mean, "you have drunk upon my holy mountain"? It doesn't mean that they took a fifth of liquor and guzzled it down. It's referring to what Zechariah the prophet said in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 2. He says, "Jerusalem in the last days will become a cup of trembling." That means, as it goes back into the book of Proverbs, when you have the cup full of the juice of the vine and the juice starts to move, it's intoxicating. So in the end times, Jerusalem shall become intoxicating. Those that control it, intoxicated with power. And here in Obadiah, he's talking to the Edomites, to the present day Palestinians. You are intoxicated with power. I can remember when at one time as a journalist I was serving in Jerusalem, President Bill Clinton came to the city. I was standing near the president and the mayor of Jerusalem then, Ehud Olmert. Bill Clinton said he'd like to go to the old city onto the Temple Mount. The mayor said he would be happy to be his personal guide. When Yasser Arafat heard about that, he went livid, and he put men, armed men with their rifles, with their grenades, to stop anybody from coming in one of those 7 gates leading up onto the Temple Mount. Here it was, a backwater terrorist, Yasser Arafat, stopping the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States, from entering that spot. Thus in verse 16, "You have drunk upon my holy mountain. You are intoxicated with power upon my holy mountain." But then it says at the end of that verse, you're going to continue to drink, but you shall be as though you have never been before. Your arrogance will be brought to an end. Verse 17 of Obadiah, "But upon Mount Zion, or in the city of Jerusalem, shall be deliverance, there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions." In other words, the Jewish people, that's the house of Jacob, the Jewish people shall receive all that God has promised to give them. And then in verse 18, "And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, a burning fire that will devour." And down through the verse it says, "And the house of Esau, the stubble, and they shall kindle in them and devour them." When Jesus Christ returns, on the day of his return, he goes to the Temple Mount. He's ready to walk into the temple. The Jews have come with him, coming from Edom, across that Jordan Valley, here to the Mount of Olives, making their way across the Kidron Valley, up through that eastern gate, onto the temple compound. And there Jesus Christ, will lead them to the temple, where he will rest with them. He will live among them, as the psalmist said, forever and ever and ever. It's on that day that the Jewish people, the house of Jacob, shall be a fire. And the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, the present day Palestinians, will be devoured. They'll be as if they have never been. The prophet Jeremiah in chapter 49, verse 18 says, "They will be as Sodom and Gomorrah. That's basically the story of two brothers. Remember what God told their mother Rebekah? There are two nations in thy womb, 25th chapter of Genesis. Two manner of people will come forth. Jacob, he became the Jewish people. Esau, the older of the two brothers, who should have had the birthright and the blessing, he had to forego that. And his younger brother, by God's sovereign selection, was made the son of promise. These two brothers, down through 4,000 years of history, as God told Moses, in constant conflict from generation until generation, now culminating here in the city of Jerusalem. God's promise, his prophecy fulfilled, the Jewish people coming to power in the land that he has promised to give them forever and ever and ever, where he will rule and reign with them and live in their presence throughout eternity future. It's the story of two brothers.